What if one of Africa's most important struggles for sovereignty does not begin in a gold mine, an oil field, or a military headquarters, but inside a laboratory with a cassava root and an orange-fleshed sweet potato? In Bobo-Dioulasso, Burkina Faso, researchers are working on something that sounds ordinary until you consider what it could mean. Cassava and sweet potatoes grown in African soil are being studied as ingredients for bread-making flour, bread, spaghetti, macaroni, and other foods that normally depend heavily on wheat. This is not yet a revolution that has transformed Burkina Faso's entire food system. It is something more modest but potentially important, an attempt to connect local agriculture with local science, processing, and everyday consumption. And that raises a much larger question. How independent can a nation truly become if some of the food on its people's tables remains vulnerable to distant supply chains, international prices, wars, transportation costs, and decisions made thousands of miles away? Under Captain Ibrahim Traore, food self-sufficiency has become part of a broader national conversation about sovereignty. But we should be precise. There is no evidence in the project information showing that Traore personally created these IRSAT research projects. Their importance lies instead in how closely their purpose fits a larger national effort to produce more at home and build greater capacity to process what Burkina Faso grows. That distinction matters because this story is bigger than one leader. It involves scientists, students, farmers, millers, processors, bakers, equipment, markets, and ultimately the families deciding what to put on their tables. In this video, we will follow that chain from the laboratory to the bakery. We will examine what cassava can realistically replace, why orange-fleshed sweet potato adds another dimension, where Ibrahim Traore actually fits into the story, and what could prevent this experiment from succeeding. Most importantly, we will ask whether something beginning with humble crops in Burkina Faso could offer a practical lesson for a much larger Pan-African future. If you want to follow the changes shaping Africa's economic sovereignty beyond the headlines, stay with this channel, because sometimes the biggest questions begin with the simplest things we eat. At the center of this experiment are two research projects evaluated by Burkina Faso's National Fund for Research and Innovation for Development at the Institute for Research in Applied Sciences and Technologies in Bobo-Dioulasso. The first project lasted 18 months. Its objective was practical: develop an improved method for turning cassava and orange-fleshed sweet potato into flour suitable for bread making, then use that flour in bread. But producing a successful sample inside the laboratory was only part of the mission. Researchers also worked to transfer the techniques and formulations to processors, millers, bakers, and pastry makers who could eventually carry the knowledge into the wider food economy. Training sessions were organized for these professionals. The project also strengthened the technical capacity of the institute through new equipment and laboratory materials. Among the equipment acquired were a bread oven, a fine grinding stainless steel mill, a kneading machine, drying tables, and equipment for washing raw materials. A second 18-month project moved beyond bread and investigated noodles made from cassava and sweet potato varieties cultivated in Burkina Faso. Researchers developed several recipes including spaghetti and macaroni, while also comparing formulations involving conventional wheat. This project did something else that matters for the future. 7 students were supervised through the research, helping knowledge move from one generation of specialists to another. The technical platform was strengthened again with equipment including a hydraulic press, a large capacity kneading machine, and a drying chamber. When the results were presented to the evaluation delegation, the Noodle project reported approximately 90% physical implementation and 100% financial implementation. Researchers said the objectives had essentially been achieved. These numbers do not mean cassava noodles are already replacing imported wheat across Burkina Faso, nor do laboratory results automatically guarantee commercial success. But something important has happened. A crop harvested from Burkina Faso's soil has entered a chain involving scientific testing, specialized machinery, technical training, students, processors, millers, and bakers. The humble cassava root is no longer being examined only as something to harvest and sell. It is being examined as something Burkina Faso might learn to transform. The next question is why this matters beyond a laboratory. The answer begins with wheat. Burkina Faso still imports wheat and wheat flour. That does not make international trade a problem by itself. No serious strategy requires a country to produce everything it consumes. The vulnerability appears when an essential food becomes heavily exposed to forces the country cannot control, including international prices, transportation costs, conflict, poor harvests elsewhere, and disruptions along distant supply chains. This is why cassava should not be presented as a magical replacement for wheat. Wheat contains gluten, which helps dough trap gas and gives bread its familiar structure. Cassava does not. Replace too much wheat without adjusting the recipe, and the bread can lose the texture consumers expect. The scientific challenge, therefore, is not simply grinding cassava into flour. Researchers must determine how much can be incorporated, how it should be processed, and which formulations can produce food that people actually want to eat. That distinction changes the entire story. Burkina Faso does not need to eliminate wheat for local crops to matter. If locally produced cassava can replace even part of the wheat required for suitable foods, more of the ingredients could come from Burkina Faso's own farms. Orange flesh sweet potato adds another possibility. Its orange color comes from compounds including beta-carotene, which the human body can convert into vitamin A. This means researchers are not only exploring a local source of carbohydrates. They are working with a crop that may also contribute useful nutritional value when incorporated appropriately into food. But none of this guarantees cheaper bread or better nutrition automatically. Processing cost, recipes, food safety, availability, consumer preferences, and the final price still determine whether an experiment can become a real industry. That is why the most useful definition of food sovereignty is not isolation. It is resilience. It is the ability to look at an imported necessity and ask whether part of that vulnerability can be reduced using local soil, local crops, local knowledge, and competitive products. The real test begins when those crops leave the farm and enter the value chain. A cassava root has limited economic value if it leaves the farmer's hands, and the story ends there. The deeper opportunity begins when we ask how many productive steps can happen before that same crop reaches a family's table. Imagine two different parts. In the first, a farmer harvests cassava and sells the raw roots. The transaction is finished quickly, and most opportunities to add value disappear with it. In the second, those roots move into a longer chain. They are purchased, cleaned, processed, dried, milled into flour, tested for quality, blended into carefully developed recipes, transformed into bread or noodles, packaged, transported, and finally sold to consumers. Every additional step requires labor, knowledge, equipment, and businesses. And every step creates another opportunity for value to remain inside Burkina Faso. This is why the equipment acquired through the IRSAT projects matters. A stainless steel mill or a hydraulic press may sound less dramatic than a political speech, but machines like these help determine whether local agriculture remains primarily a source of raw commodities or becomes the foundation for processing industries. Yet ownership of the crop alone is not enough. Burkina Faso also needs reliable electricity, transportation, drying capacity, food safety standards, financing, skilled workers, and consumers willing to buy the finished products. Cassava deteriorates quickly after harvesting, so processing facilities must also connect efficiently with producing areas. There is another question that cannot be ignored. Who receives the additional value? If processors and large companies prosper while small farmers continue receiving very little, then a longer value chain does not automatically produce broad economic sovereignty. Farmers, including women and small producers who play important roles in African food systems, must have a realistic opportunity to participate and benefit. This is where the IRSAT experiment becomes more interesting than a loaf of bread. The institute is not merely examining a crop, it is helping develop technical knowledge, equipment capacity, training, and processing methods around that crop. Cassava may be humble, but the ability to transform it safely, efficiently, and competitively is not. And that is where agriculture begins to become industry. This is where Captain Ibrahim Traore enters the story, but his role must be understood carefully. There is no evidence in the project information showing that Traore personally created the two IRSAT projects or instructed researchers to develop cassava bread and noodles. The connection is broader and, in many ways, more important. Since 2023, Traore has repeatedly placed food sovereignty near the center of Burkina Faso's national priorities. He has publicly questioned why a country with agricultural potential should remain dependent on imported food. His government has launched major agricultural initiatives designed to increase domestic production, improve access to equipment and inputs, and move the country toward greater food self-sufficiency. That effort has involved tractors, irrigation equipment, pumps, improved seeds, fertilizers, and support for agricultural production. It has also included an important idea that connects directly with what is happening at IRSAT. Burkina Faso should not merely grow more, it should develop the capacity to transform more of what it grows. Traore later expressed this philosophy in remarkably simple terms. Produce what we eat, transform what we produce, and consume what we transform. That idea reaches far beyond cassava. It asks whether Burkina Faso can move from an economy that often sells agricultural products with limited processing toward one that keeps more stages of production, knowledge, employment, and value inside the country. This is why the IRSAT research fits naturally into the larger political environment, even without evidence that Traore personally directed it. A president can establish priorities, a government can provide resources and create incentives. But neither a speech nor a presidential initiative can turn cassava into commercially successful bread. Scientists must solve technical problems. Farmers must produce reliable crops. Processors must meet standards. Businesses must control costs. Consumers must accept the products. Traore's most relevant role, therefore, is not that of an inventor. It is that of a political leader trying to make domestic production and food sovereignty part of Burkina Faso's broader definition of independence. Whether that vision succeeds will ultimately be decided far beyond the presidential office. If Burkina Faso wants greater control over its food system, another question follows. Who controls the knowledge required to transform what the country grows? Land alone is not enough. A nation can produce cassava, sweet potatoes, cotton, or grain and still depend heavily on outside expertise for processing, testing, machinery, and product development. That is why the work taking place at IRSAT matters beyond the recipes themselves. Local scientific capacity means researchers can begin with a problem their own communities face. They can study crops available in their own environment, test different processing methods, adapt technologies to local conditions, and transfer what works to people who can use it. The cassava and sweet potato projects show several parts of that process working together. Researchers develop formulations, students participate and gain experience, processors learn new techniques, millers and bakers receive training. Equipment strengthens the institute's ability to continue testing and improving products. 7 students were supervised through the Noodle project alone. That may sound like a small detail, but knowledge becomes sustainable only when it moves from one generation to another. Scientific sovereignty should not mean rejecting knowledge from abroad. Burkina Faso does not need to isolate its laboratories from international research. The stronger goal is to build enough domestic expertise to evaluate outside technology, adapt useful ideas, improve them, and develop solutions when imported models do not fit local realities. This distinction matters across Africa. A country that owns raw materials but lacks the knowledge to process them can remain trapped near the beginning of the value chain. Another country may perform the refining, formulation, manufacturing, branding, and distribution, where much of the additional economic value is created. But when scientists, farmers, processors, universities, and businesses begin working around the same local resource, that relationship can change. The African Union has increasingly emphasized agricultural research, innovation, education, and local processing as part of the continent's wider food system transformation. Burkina Faso's laboratory experiments are still small compared with that continental ambition. Yet they demonstrate the principle clearly. Sovereignty is not only about owning what lies beneath your soil or grows above it. It is also about developing the knowledge to decide what that resource can become. If this idea can work in Burkina Faso, the next question is whether it can travel across Africa. The answer should not begin with the claim that every African country must copy Burkina Faso's cassava experiment. Africa is too diverse for that. Different climates, crops, diets, markets, and farming systems require different solutions. But the method can travel. Other African countries have already explored similar approaches. Orange-fleshed sweet potato has been introduced into commercial food products in countries including Kenya, Rwanda, Malawi, and Uganda. Researchers, farmers, processors, and bakeries have worked together to turn locally grown crops into products that modern consumers can recognize and purchase. That experience points toward a practical form of Pan-African cooperation. Imagine Burkina Faso developing expertise in cassava processing while another country improves sweet potato varieties. A third develops affordable drying equipment. Another builds stronger distribution networks. Universities share research. African businesses adapt machinery. Farmers gain access to larger regional markets. No country has to do everything alone. This is also close to the direction the African Union has established for the continent's agricultural future. Its agricultural strategy for the coming decade calls for substantially higher food production, greater local processing, lower post-harvest losses, and a major expansion of agricultural trade between African countries. That last objective matters. Pan-African economic strength does not require Africa to withdraw from world trade. It means building stronger internal capacity so African countries can trade with the world from a position of greater resilience while also buying and selling more from one another. Burkina Faso's cassava research is still far too small to call it a continental transformation, but it illustrates what such a transformation could look like at ground level. A farmer grows the crop, a scientist improves its use, a processor adds value, a business brings the product to market. Another African country learns from the process and adapts it to its own conditions. Pan-Africanism then becomes more than speeches, flags, or political declarations. It becomes a network of knowledge, production, processing, and trade. And if that network grows strong enough, Africa's most ordinary crops may begin carrying something extraordinary, a larger share of the continent's own economic value. But a promising idea can become dangerous when enthusiasm turns it into a myth. Cassava presents real challenges. Once harvested, the roots deteriorate quickly, which means farmers, transportation, and processing facilities must be closely connected. Poor drying can damage flour quality. Inconsistent processing can produce inconsistent food. And because cassava naturally contains compounds that can release cyanide, proper preparation and quality control are essential for safe consumption. Then there is a problem of bread itself. Cassava has no gluten, so increasing the amount used in wheat-based bread can change its volume, texture, and structure. Researchers can improve formulations, but science cannot simply erase the physical characteristics of the crop. Commercial reality creates another test. A product that succeeds in a laboratory does not automatically succeed in a bakery or supermarket. Consumers will judge taste, texture, availability, safety, and price. National pride may encourage someone to try locally produced cassava bread once. Quality must persuade that person to buy it again. Scaling production also requires reliable electricity, roads, water, drying equipment, financing, standards, and stable demand. Expanding cassava cultivation before processors and markets are ready could even leave farmers with more roots than they can profitably sell. And food self-sufficiency must not be confused with universal food security. A country can increase national production while families in conflict-affected or isolated areas still struggle to obtain food. That is why Burkina Faso should ultimately judge this experiment through measurable results. Are farmers earning more? Are processors surviving commercially? Are consumers buying the products voluntarily? Is quality consistent? Is local processing expanding? Is dependence on imported ingredients being reduced where it makes economic sense? The real achievement will not be proving that cassava can become bread. It will be proving that an entire system can make that bread safely, competitively, repeatedly, and at a scale that improves people's lives. At this point, another question enters the debate. How has the outside world reacted to Burkina Faso's new direction? The answer is more complicated than many social media stories suggest. There is no reliable evidence that France, the United States, European governments, or Western wheat exporters are attacking Burkina Faso because researchers are making bread and noodles from cassava. Claims that the West is frightened by cassava bread may sound dramatic, but the evidence we examine does not support them. The criticism that does exist is broader. Western media have questioned the heroic image surrounding Ibrahim Traore. Some reports focus on restrictions on political opposition and the press, continuing insecurity, relations with Russia, and the enormous amount of pro-Traore content circulating online. Some skepticism is justified. False stories have repeatedly appeared around Burkina Faso. Images have been misrepresented as completed factories. Statements have been falsely attributed to Traore. Manipulated videos have presented achievements or announcements that never occurred. Those falsehoods do not strengthen Burkina Faso's case. They weaken it. If a real laboratory in Bobo-Dioulasso is developing cassava flour, bread, spaghetti, and macaroni, why invent achievements that researchers have not yet delivered? There is also a serious food security challenge that supporters of Traore should not ignore. Burkina Faso has increased agricultural investment and production, yet large numbers of people continue facing acute food insecurity, especially where conflict, displacement, poverty, and disrupted markets make food difficult to access. That does not necessarily prove agriculture policy has failed. National production and household access to food are different questions. The fairest test is therefore neither Western approval nor Pan-African enthusiasm. It is evidence. Are domestic yields improving? Are farmers benefiting? Are processing businesses surviving? Are locally produced foods competitive? Is vulnerability to unnecessary imports declining? And can these gains continue without hiding the country's very real difficulties? Burkina Faso does not need every criticism from the West to be wrong for its agricultural ambitions to deserve attention. And it does not need every claim made in its name to be true. The strongest answer to skepticism is not propaganda. It is measurable results. So, what should the rest of Africa take from this experiment? The first lesson is not to copy Burkina Faso's products. It is to copy the method. Every country should begin with its own crops, climates, skills, and consumer needs. The right answer may be cassava in one place, millet in another, sorghum, maize, plantain, or sweet potato somewhere else. The second lesson is that farming cannot stand alone. Agriculture becomes more powerful when farmers are connected to scientists, processes, equipment, financing, and markets. Growing more is important. Transforming more of what is grown is where additional jobs and value can emerge. The third lesson is simple. Made in Africa must compete. Patriotism may encourage consumers to support a local product, but quality, safety, price, and availability will determine whether they continue buying it. And the fourth lesson may be the most important. Self-reliance does not require isolation. Burkina Faso can trade with the world while becoming less vulnerable in areas where local production makes sense. Mali and Niger can pursue their own advantages. Leaders such as Ibrahim Traore, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Chiani may speak about sovereignty, but lasting sovereignty will depend on institutions and ordinary people long after any individual leader is gone. That is where the African Union and wider Pan-African cooperation become important. West Africa and the Sahel do not need 50 different countries trying to manufacture everything alone. They need stronger networks in which African knowledge, crops, technology, processing, and markets reinforce one another. Relations with France or any other external partner should ultimately be judged by the same principle. Does the relationship expand African capacity or preserve unnecessary dependence? That is the larger story behind today's African news. Back in Bobo-Dioulasso, a cassava root entering a laboratory does not prove that Burkina Faso has defeated food dependency. It proves something quieter. A question is being tested. Can Africa keep more of the value created from what grows on African soil? If scientists, farmers, students, processors, businesses, and consumers can answer yes together, then an ordinary crop can become more than food. It can become one small foundation of economic dignity. Tell us which crop in your country deserves this kind of investment, and follow the channel as we continue examining the choices shaping Africa's future.